this presentation is going to be a little bit of both. So I'm going to introduce Chris. So Chris Butler is a product manager, writer, and speaker. He's had over 20 years of product management leadership at Microsoft, Waze, Kayak, and Facebook Reality Labs. And he's currently Assistant Vice President, Head of Product Operations and Cognizance. So Chris is going to take us through some information on communal computing and sort of establish what the problem space is, and then give us some options on how we can solve that. So Chris, I'll let you take it over now.
Great. Thank you so much. Great to see everybody today, and looking forward to speaking to you about communal computing. I have presented here before, back when I was at IPsoft working on conversational agents. And so definitely have been continuing to work in this space. And yeah, I guess communal computing, just to start at a very high level, I'm going to give you a quick overview of what it is. I want to talk a bit about the problems that come up for these communal computing devices, and then a way forward, and then what are you supposed to do if you're actually a skilled developer building on tops of these platforms, even if the platform is not necessarily trying to address the problems that we're going to identify. And so first, what is communal computing, right? I would actually call a communal device really anything that's in the home or office space that is used by people together, and usually not in a one-on-one way. And so that would include things like the Amazon Echo was one of the first kind of general computing connected devices that was available in the home. I'd say, you know, screen devices like this is the Google Home Hub, the Echo Show, things like that. Even the idea of like IoT, connected light bulbs, connected sockets, they're used by everybody within the household to say control something like a light switch or a lamp. And even the Apple TV. So, you know, TV, over the top OTT boxes, Chrome sticks, Amazon Fire Sticks, the Roku, they're all shared experiences in the sense that multiple people can be interacting with them at the same time. And that could be just watching, but it could also be trying to choose a show. And then I would even argue that maybe the original communal device that was really connected to a network was that landline telephone that we used to have in our kitchens, where it was really more about the place than it was about the person. So the phone number that was called was meant to call the entire household, and you never really knew exactly who would pick up. But then whoever did end up picking up took on the duty of forwarding that call to the appropriate person in that household. So I'd say all of these things are what I would call communal devices or communal computing in general. And so, you know, generally, I would love to hear in the chat if people want to bring up, are there any communal computing devices that I didn't mention that you have in your own homes? And so, yeah, I actually, Lil Ree says IoT devices. Yeah, totally think that IoT devices that could be used by anybody in the home would be kind of considered a communal computing device, especially if, you know, people like not just me, but say my wife or my kids would want to be able to use a particular device. I would definitely consider that some type of communal computing. What are some other things there that people wanted to mention? Roku, Chromecast, totally agree with that. Yeah, anything to do with the TV. And actually my past, when I was working at Facebook Reality Labs, I worked on the Portal device, which was both for the TV and a standalone screen device that did video calling. And so I'd also consider those communal computing devices. Anyone else? Well, great. So we'll just move on. I think that what's really important when we start thinking and talking about these devices are really the problems that come up with communal computing, and part of the reason why we're here to talk about this today. So the first thing is, if you look here, this is the kind of one of the starting or home screens for Spotify. This is my Spotify account. So there's a lot of music here that I listen to on a regular basis. There's actually one playlist that is not mine. And what happens is that because my children end up using our Google Home Hub in the kitchen to play their music all the time, this particular playlist, which Kristen Anderson Lopez is really from Frozen. And so things like certain types of musicals, kid shows, a bunch of different music ends up getting grouped into this made for Chris Butler playlist. But it's not actually for me, because it was made based on the behavioral data that was collected by a particular device in my household that my account happened to be connected to. And so, why are they built wrong, right? And really the key reason is because of this single user context, which single user context actually comes from the academic and research setting of early mainframe computers, where when it was first a mainframe that you had to walk up to and basically insert all your punch cards to get it to run, it was very easy to tell who was using the machine because you could see them in front of it. There was some type of physical activity that was taking place. But then once you started to have a servant-client architecture, people could connect from anywhere, say in the building, to that mainframe or that centralized server. And you wanted to start to then do what was referred to as time sharing of the resources of that computer. And you needed to start having people to log in as a single person. Now, this made sense when it came to server-client architecture, especially when we're talking about time sharing. But when it started to think about the idea of like, how does someone use a TV in the home? For a long time, TVs didn't really care much about login, right? They were mostly about who was sitting in front of it and how they negotiated the norms to be able to then decide what they were watching. And so when that whole context of kind of the single user context moved into the home from academia and from research, there were a lot of reasons from a security standpoint that may have been the case when we were using computers in offices. But for a long time, people didn't think about accounts as their home computer, especially when we talked about the shared PC. But once you started getting into the world of kind of the Echo being attached to your Amazon account, that's when all of this starts to go wrong. And so to get at the reason why this happens for Spotify is we have to look at the way that recommendations happen. And so this is an illustration for a particular article about Spotify recommendations and kind of how collaborative filtering works. And so if, for example, John likes A, B, C, D as far as songs, and I like songs B, C, D, E, because we have the overlap of B, C, D, that would mean that I would get the recommendations from John of song A, and vice versa, John would get the recommendation of song E. And if you look at the way that, this is a slide actually from a Spotify presentation at a TensorFlow conference about how it uses specifically logging the user feedback, which is both implicit, so they listen to a song, and explicit, so they liked it or they added it to a playlist. And this goes wrong because when we can't depend on the single user context to be true, the behavioral data that we're collected is actually faulty in some way. And so, or not faulty, but it's not just for me. And so when we now replace this with my personal mobile phone, that's my own phone that I carry around with me, and I replace it with something like the Google Home Hub that's sitting in a public or semi-public space like my kitchen, that logging of user feedback then starts to muddy things an awful lot. And they've tried to address this. I don't mean to pick on Spotify because I think they're probably trying to do more than other services are with things like their Duo and family mixes, where if you have an account, you can have multiple different people that are on that one account. And then inside of that, you actually get a combination playlist, where in this case, it's mostly the union of likes between different people. And so you can see there kind of below that there's different people's avatars that are added to each song to show all the different people that actually like that song. It is limited though, it's only 50 songs, it's updated weekly. And they do have to think about the idea of children potentially using these playlists as well, which is why they've included something like explicit song filtering. So they've definitely been trying to make this better, but I don't think they're quite there yet. And so that's because there's really kind of 5 classes of problems that I've identified that happen with these types of communal computing devices. So the first one is really around identity. Who is in front of the device? And the second thing is privacy, which is, should they have access to the information that's in front of them? Should everybody that's in front of the device right now have access to this information? Same thing with security. Are they allowed to do this right now? Are there any restrictions on what they should be able to do with that device? The next thing is experience, which is how do we actually operate not just with one person that logged into that device originally, but also for anybody that could be using it and multiple people at the same time. And then finally, ownership. What happens when you're installing these devices into a public space where not everybody has explicitly actually accepted the terms of use for that particular device? And so when we talk about identity, there's really a range of people that could be using that device. And so this is actually a illustration from the 3 article series that I did with the O'Reilly Radar blog around communal computing, where you have a very wide range of trust. So on the far right, there's me and my partner, who I probably trust the most out of all these people to understand the norms and adhere to them. But then there are people like my children, in-laws that are living with me, guests, even service workers, cleaners, other people that come to the place that I live, to landlords and to the person that I probably trust the least, which is like people that are not have no authorized access to be there, so like burglars. And so we have to start to contend with all of these different people could be in the space at any time and would start interacting with these devices, or would want to. And then we talk about privacy. I've used this, this concept that comes from a book called Privacy in Context, which is really contextual integrity. And contextual integrity speaks about this idea that people don't want just, say, public or private information, but they want to be able to control the information in the appropriate time and place. And so this is a great example of where IBM ended up using a bunch of Flickr information where there were all these photos that were actually collected under Creative Commons licensing. But when they first published those photos, the people that were publishing those photos under the Creative Commons licensing, they were expecting it to be used as, maybe stock art or something that people would be able to view within the Flickr context. But then when used for facial recognition training, this actually changed what their understanding of the endpoint of the data is. And so that in the world of contextual integrity, it would actually say that it has violated the set of norms that were originally created for this data. And so privacy ends up getting very tricky when you start thinking about that there could be multiple people viewing the content on these devices. That as well as the idea of security. And so, security not only is what should this person have access to, should we authenticate them additionally, but it's also what starts to happen when the people that are in that space either leave the space or should have restricted permissions with it. And so this is a really important article in the New York Times about how kind of victims of domestic abuse can continue to be harassed after people move out of the household by using the thermostats, video cameras, etc. And so there's a whole group of people I saw actually in Texas where their security experts are going in and spending hours helping people that are victims of domestic abuse, kind of resetting all of the privacy and security controls for their IoT and home devices, because these types of things are not thought of when we're building them in the first place. Next is experience. And so this is just like another picture from that O'Reilly blog where I ended up posting about communal computing. But when it comes to experience, the Amazon Alexa started to understand interacting with multiple people at the same time, but there's still this issue about are we actually in some way, like if it's my son and I yelling at the device to play our music, there's actually an adversarial relationship, versus in other cases, maybe we're sitting in front of the TV as a family and we're trying to decide what to watch, where it's more about like cooperative experiences. And so we have to start to think about not just about one person interacting with these devices, but potentially multiple people at the same time. And then finally, ownership, right? So in this particular case, Amazon ended up buying this company called Blink, which had specialty security cameras that people had bought and then integrated with a bunch of different basically technologies in their home. But what that meant also is that now that Amazon owned it, they decided that certain uses were no longer appropriate. And so this is where I think ownership really becomes trickier when we start to think about not only the fact that this particular thing that's now installed in my home that's part of my infrastructure could change from terms of use, but also what does that mean for other people that are coming into the household that have not yet actually accepted those terms of use. And so the way forward I really think we need to go with is really this idea of thinking about ecosystems. So it's not so much about what Dr. Sally Appleman would refer to as design individualism, where we make this mistake of thinking about a device and a person as like one relationship. We need to think about all the different people, devices, and services that are part of it. And so this is a good example of where the red the red dots in this network are really people, whereas all the other white dots here are devices or services. And when you think about the fact that even though I may not always be directly connected with every single one of these people, in some way, we are intermediated by these devices and services, and we need to think about them holistically in a way that will help us understand better the impacts of these things. And so, and there's a lot of things, right? So this is actually a slide from Google I/O earlier this year. You can see that there's a huge number of devices that are now in the home that are connected in some way, just to the Google I/O environment. But you also then take Amazon, you take all these other manufacturers that are out there, and you start to have almost everything in your household could have an internet connection and could in some way interact with each other. So some of the do's that I put together, I'm not going to go into them too deep, but is definitely you should be doing research within your own user's environment, seeing how they're going to use it within that context. You should build for everybody that has access, and that means everybody, including people that may not have authorized access. You need to consider these pseudo identities where, when I say pseudo identity, it means that I'm not only someone that has a family personality and a work personality, but also groups of friends, hobbies, etc. We need to be concerned with the fact that actually the way that our pseudo identities are built around networks with other groups that are not right in that moment. We need to evolve with the space. So as people continue to use their home, they're constantly moving things around. Stuart Brand has a really great book, How Buildings Learn, which is all about this. And then do use behavioral data if you can use it in a way that's valuable, that is actually appropriate for its use. But as you can see with the behavioral data from Spotify, it may not be appropriate to be used in this case. And some of the don'ts are, don't assume that automation will work in all contexts, right? The norms within the household are very specific and can be changed and renegotiated over time. So don't always assume that you can do what you need or what's going on in that household context. You shouldn't include every possible piece of a service. So like if you're someone like Google, it may be appropriate to show shared calendar information, but showing my email or my personal messages probably not appropriate in these types of platforms. You shouldn't assume that your devices will be the only ones, right? Like people are going to buy piecemeal lots of different devices and try to put them together. So you can't always assume that interoperability will be on your own terms. You shouldn't change the terms without an out for the owners, right? You shouldn't brick devices like Sonos was trying to do with some of their home speakers for older devices when they were still working perfectly fine. And don't require personal mobile apps to use the device, right? There are going to be lots of people that are guests in your household or children that don't have phones that should still be able to turn on lights. And so requiring them to do so through an app is actually overly limiting. So now what are you supposed to do if you're, say, an Alexa skill developer and Alexa does have some capability for understanding this, but not enough to address all of these problems? So there's really 4 things that I recommend. One is to use voice profiles if available. And we'll talk about what those are, how in depth they're actually available today. You shouldn't trust behavioral data, like I said previously, from some of these communal devices quite in the same way you would from personal devices. You should build pseudo identities around the location rather than the person. And then finally, ask when in doubt. And so voice profiles are something that Alexa has started to provide, I think a couple years ago at this point, where it could, within a single Amazon account, could start to segment based on different people's voices that would then be attached to other things like music profiles and things like that. There's actually no public numbers available for how many people actually use these things. But what you'll find is that probably not as many people are actually implementing them because it still is dependent on the Amazon account of the original person that set it up. So if I wanted to go in and add my voice profile, it's actually a little bit harder than me just like saying that I'm a new voice profile in the household. And then just really quickly, there are a bunch of different, we look at like Apple, Amazon, and Google. There are a bunch of these services that are now starting to look at both voice-based and then other types of biometric recognition that can allow you to automatically start to segment the data that you collect. The next thing around behavioral data and not trusting it is that it's perfectly fine when I have a very personal phone that behavioral data is now being added to my personal behavioral database. But the issue comes in when we start to actually try to add behavioral data from a group device into the context of a personal one. And so I would just argue that you should not be automatically creating, like adding all this like central device information. And one of the things you can also do with this is that if you start to see huge discrepancies depending on the channel that you're actually getting behavioral data from, you should assume that it's not because this person is completely different in every channel. Right? Most of our music tastes are actually solidified in our early to mid 20s. And so if suddenly I start listening to a completely different type of music on a channel or device that could be communal, that is a good guess that there's actually more than just that person listening to that music. The next thing around building pseudo identities around location, right, rather than a person, is that these devices are actually going to be deployed in a lot of places. So it could be in a living room like this Echo Show. It could be in a kitchen like this Echo. It could be in a bedroom, and it could also even be in a bathroom to be able to play music. And so the use cases for these different locations could be very different, right? The idea of the living room is probably more communal for listening to music, checking on weather, getting ready, like getting everybody ready together to get out the door. Whereas the kitchen maybe is around certain meal times. Bedrooms could be waking up and going to sleep. And then bathrooms could be getting ready for the day. And so these are all very different situations that if you don't necessarily separate out the different uses of these things, you may be getting very different profiles of behavioral data. And so the location itself is probably more meaningful than the person in this case. And so that would mean that when we go to this, this idea of kind of, we're not going to be adding behavioral data to my personal, we should also consider segmenting in a way that we should create recommendation profiles for those particular locations rather than people. And I think that's more valuable. And then finally, when I say ask in doubt, it really can be up to the individual that is making these commands to these devices to be able to decide whether it is appropriate for the room to proceed with something. And so, for example, like it may be appropriate if I'm by myself to request what my bank account balance would be. But if for some reason it overhears it incorrectly, or someone asks accidentally or something like that, it should really double check that this is the appropriate environment to do such a thing. And definitely not do it automatically unless it's really clear that that's what the person wants. So in the end, I just want to say that, when we're thinking about these devices, we should be considering them as an ecosystem of people, devices, and services. And they're part of the home and office, and they actually extend outside of the home and office as well. So just because it's about the devices in my home, it's also the other devices that my information may show up in. Say, like my mom has a picture frame, which I'm able to edit the photos that go on there. And if you want more information, there's 3 articles that are on the O'Reilly blog, if you want to check those out. And then I've done a couple different talks here, including a workshop around animistic design mapping, which is really interesting for how we understand the interaction between these devices. So yeah, thank you. This was kind of like a quick run through of communal computing. Happy to answer questions and kind of see what people think about this. If you'd like to tweet at me or email me, these are my contact information. So thank you everybody for that.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate that. So I really like that you showed the different kind of manufacturers and kind of the glimmers of hope already on what's available now to help identify users and let us get a little bit past that. What else do you see like on the horizon? Like, is there anything else coming that you think might be useful?
Yeah, I mean, the one problem that I kind of keep on coming back to is that a lot of the platforms are not really that open right now, right? So Alexa has its huge skills database. It's questionable about whether they see that as a long-term approach to their benefit, because there's this constant problem of kind of how do they not only get distribution of Alexa, but then how do certain devices get specialty wake words? And there's this whole consortium that I've started to participate in just around like, how do you allow for routing of things between different agents and wake words? And so there's a lot of like stuff that's out there that I think just shows that we haven't really figured out the right way to build these types of usage models for agents. And I think this thing I mentioned around animistic design mapping, animism really comes from this idea that we consider both kind of animate and inanimate objects as having spirits. And it's a way of us trying to think about a way to, what are our expectations for these devices? And so I think just this is a long way of saying, like, for example, I would expect my Echo to be spoken to and speak back to me, because it's a speaker, it has a microphone, there's a bunch of things like that. But when we talk about the lamp, like if we talk about like a really connected home, the lamp itself, I don't expect to talk to me, right? I don't expect everything in my house to talk to me. And so the question becomes like, do we start getting used to the idea of coordinators that are things like the Alexa, right, in an Echo, as being the coordinator for all of these IoT devices that are in my home? Or do I, as sensors and microphones and processing and network gets cheaper and cheaper, that every device ends up having its own kind of capability, we start to get into a weird space about which one of these makes the most sense from a coordination standpoint. So I think like, maybe this is not the thing you wanted to hear, but I think like things are going to get a lot weirder and harder to understand at first before we start to see consolidation and kind of patterns that start to make much more sense. Because like if you look at Google Home Hub, right, I don't think that you can build skills for Google Home Hub in quite the same way you can for Alexa. You probably have to have a relationship with them from a business development standpoint first, right? And so I think that you're going to see like a lot of different ways that this happens. And then with IoT, right, like thankfully, most IoT manufacturers now will integrate with someone like Alexa or Google Home Hub or one of those like smart home type of things, but they're still not making it quite as easy to allow for kind of multiple profiles within the home. And then we have to get into the whole idea that it gets really hard actually to understand consent issues, right? So as we start getting new privacy laws that are being built, not only at a country by country level, right? So GDPR, new privacy laws in the United States, but also on state by state levels. So like the CCPA in California, there are specialty facial recognition laws within the state of Illinois, Texas, and Washington, right? We start to get into a really hard place where for these people that want to even start to understand what does it mean to kind of collect voice data or differentiate between different profiles of voice data, are they legally allowed to in the future? And so I don't know. It's just like we're in a really hard spot right now. I think I'm probably proposing more just identification of the problems than I am about perfect solutions by any means. But I do think if we kind of hit the reset button, I think we get to a better place where just even that idea of just saying like, well, so this device is in a kitchen somewhere, just understanding what does the kitchen want? Like, what do the people that go to the kitchen want? I think gets us way further than this idea of like, oh, I already have Chris Butler's, like Alexa and Amazon account. And now I'm trying to like remove the parts that don't make sense in a public context. That's way harder than building something from scratch based on that location, essentially.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. While you could possibly, I think Amazon tries to get you to order things no matter where you are.
Yeah.
But I'm probably more interested in ordering computer things when I'm in my office and maybe reorder some snack when I'm in the kitchen. So that might be an interesting way to get the right message at the right time.
They're experimenting with all this stuff, right? Like a lot of the time with those button devices that they had, or there's like scale devices that they have that they're now part of their like Amazon Go, or even like the Amazon Astro that just came out. A lot of this stuff, like there is a huge team that just does voice shopping, right? And the problem they're always going to have though is this kind of like imperfect information problem. And so until we start to get to the point that you get super high confidence levels in when you need to reorder something, right? I think that they're just going to have this problem that you're still going to have to ask. And if you have to ask, shopping is really hard via voice because you can't compare quite as easily. And you don't know exactly what you're getting, right? We're incredibly visual. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think that's the reason why Alexa continues to be a priority, is this idea of like integration with the home. The home as a platform, I think is a high priority for Amazon. It's whether all of these third-party skills and the value of the questionable value, right? Because a majority of skills don't end up getting used either, right? And that's because they're not as discoverable as they could be. And so, I don't know. I think this is where we do want our homes to be connected in some way, right? Like the idea that we buy digital picture frames, and like I have one for my mom where she gets to see all the new photos from our kids being put on there automatically. That's a huge benefit, right? Or the Facebook portal TV is the best video calling device because it uses the largest screen that we have in our household, right? And so there's all these advantages to connected services inside the home. It's just we're still caught up in this like kind of single user context. And I've talked to a bunch of people in the industry where some of the reactions I've gotten have been either, well, we don't worry about those edge cases because we just need to get the core case right. And I think that kind of mistakens this idea that people don't see this as weirdness and start to trust their devices less and less. And then the other side is like, well, we're so far down this path that there's never going to be a time that we're going to move away from the single user context. And honestly, that's true until you get disrupted, right? And so yeah. I think that's always true about these types of things, is that there is going to be someone that's going to come along that's going to be better in the home environment than these other devices, and they're going to be much more successful. So that's my kind of plea to the industry, is to really think about these problems, and then maybe for the incumbents is to be wary of disruptors. And for disruptors, please use this as a way to disrupt, I guess.
Yeah, makes sense. I did want to open it up to our audience. If anyone has a question, can go ahead, unmute and ask Chris.
Yeah, I'd even be happy just to hear stories about weirdness that you've come across with your own usage of these like communal devices. Or yeah, I mean, do you disagree with this, right? I think this is something that I've noticed when building, Alexa skills, working on the portal, a bunch of different cases where, it's never as simple as just a single person, right? There's always someone else that gets impacted in some way, even if it's in a secondary effect. So.
Hi, this is Victor. Thank you, Chris, for the talk. Really interesting. Sometimes more knowledge make you more more confused. I mean, I didn't even know this was a problem before, but that's really interesting to see, because I'm working on the financial services area, and you even show an example of that. It makes sense. I mean, I don't want people asking confidential information about my balance account and etc. And what about have you ever considered, I mean, I know you didn't come with the lens of fixing the issue, but have you ever considered or read about the use of voice recognition? I mean, if you just have this kind of gateway first before anything, where we can recognize your voice, maybe this could be a way to, hey, why are you asking about the balance account? You're not Victor, you're not Chris.
Yeah. No, I think that's why. So biometric recognition, I talked about this in the second post about communal computing, but biometric recognition, there is a lot of potential benefit for it, but not everyone is always going to consent or opt in to building a profile in your household, right? So I may do that, and I actually did that, and I asked my wife very politely to do that with their Google Home Hub for face and voice match, just to see how it works out. But our kids, for example, cannot consent into having their voice profiles created. In California, I think the consent age will end up being 16. But nationally, I don't think most lawyers that end up working for these companies will want it for it to be below 18. And so I think there's going to be a whole bunch of people that are either not able to consent into creating voice profiles, right? Or there are people that will not want to, like my guests, they will not want to opt into a voice profile. And so this gets into like a really, and I'd say the same thing for facial recognition, right? And there's a book actually that's come out by Joe Turow that I'm blanking out on the name, but it's all about like this kind of huge industry of like voice collection, not only for identification, but also for looking at like, what is your emotional state and other types of markers like that. So I think like there's potentially some benefits, but we're going to get into a really odd space around what is opt-in or opt-out and consent around this. So the huge issue right now with like the Ray-Ban Facebook AR spectacles, which are basically just cameras, right? The issue there is that, is it up to me as an individual that sees someone with these Ray-Ban glasses to walk up to them and tell them I do not consent to be videoed, right? Should it actually be the other way around? And so one of these ideas could be that, for the most part, most people shouldn't actually be identified by their voice at first unless they opt in and they see it as an advantage to doing so. It doesn't mean that you still can't tell the difference between an authorized user that has opted in and someone who hasn't. But I think you get into a really tricky space about what is opt-in for the idea of like someone that just comes in my house, should their voice print be created in some way to be identified later, even as just a unique person, and how much control should they have over that data? And these are really hard questions to answer, right? I think like a lot of the video doorbells that, both the Amazon Ring, the Google Nest Hello, or whatever they're going to be calling in the next iteration, they get into a lot of trouble. I think they're going to get into a lot of trouble because like people walking down the street are not consenting to being videoed.
Yeah.
Right. And movie people that, basically like do movies, they have to like get an explicit written consent to be on videotape to a certain extent. So these are, yes, we do want convenience, which is what biometric recognition should give us, is convenience to get personalized experiences. And that could also be across multiple people, right? Like if both my wife and I have consented and opted into this, if we're both talking to Alexa to choose a show or Siri or whatever, right? It should use our preferences to try to combine and now build a joint experience for that, which by the way has been something that like OTT video and like, I've done a lot of work for different like video companies before. Like that is the dream, is to get to this idea. Like even Nielsen, they try to understand like who's sitting on the couch so they can get more accurate understanding of like share, right? So I think like there's a real argument for convenience, but for everybody else that doesn't get that convenience benefit, that is where we start to really get a lot of problems.
Thank you.
It almost makes me think of like how could this go wrong? Like everyone's got AR glasses, and it's like the cookie banner pops up everywhere you are. Do you consent to be on this person's video? You consent for that, like
exactly the GDPR.
Yes, exactly.
Like, accepts that this person.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, but I think like this is the thing though, is that we are still talking about like, and Facebook has tried to do this a lot with the way that we are connected to other people, and it's not functional for us to be connected to 7 billion people, right? We know that's not true. But we do know that like the groups and the way that I'm connected with other people, either at work, at home, family, you know, like all these different ways that I end up being connected to people, it is about the connection that actually matters. And so I think there's something to be benefited from the standpoint of like, if we're all part of the same friends group and we have a certain kind of expectation for privacy inside this friends group, it could mean that we want to automatically be identified as well, or even in like a networking group, right? Like we may enter into an agreement during a networking group to be identified automatically, right? Because it helps provide context for that type of thing. But that's very different than this idea of I'm just walking down the street and, you know, I'm basically doing the equivalent of like searching for criminals for the police, or people that have warrants outstanding for them, or looking at license plates to see who's illegally parked, right? Like those are very different circumstances than it comes to the idea of like opting into a networking event. And so I think that's where you will see this difference going forward. And it will mean that it will be harder for companies, right? I mean, I was just doing a podcast the other day and we were talking about kind of data and how people, like basically for data scientists and product people that work in the data science world, but things are going to get much trickier for the idea of consent collection of data because of regulatory rules that are going to be coming up, not only in Europe, but in the US, and then what the expectations of consumers are. And so even though you want to say build, say like even just the idea of speech to text or the idea of voice recognition, models that are built with data that has not been cleared and consented properly will have to be thrown away at a certain point. And so, like, that is a real issue that is going to come up for all of these organizations as time goes on.
One more thing that's kind of coming to mind, it's almost like you compartmentalize different aspects of your data that you're willing to share, and how much of that is kind of done for you versus you can be tweaky about it, like a firewall, almost like this port, that port, in, out, like how many people have the patience to do that. But then I think about like fingerprinting, where like it's a while back, I'm sure you've heard about it, and some of our audience has, like the Netflix prize, where like, here, we're just going to dump a bunch of movie rating information. And some people figured out that like, oh, I can combine this with IMDb and figure out like who this person actually is, or like all the advertisers that take your user agent from the browser, and between like the version of the browser and all this other stuff they add, they figure out like this is you browsing different sites and it's the same person. So it's very tricky. It's almost like an arms race. Like, how do you get just enough data out without kind of leaking too much and having it be recombined and somehow it's you again?
Yeah, I mean, this is where the reason why there needs to be the ability for me to control my information is so important, and a cornerstone of this contextual integrity privacy framework is that it really is that it's not that I want all of my medical information to be private. It's that I only want like a doctor that I've authorized to look at my medical information. Or if I'm going to join some type of cohort of like medical testing, like I want that to actually be provided, but I don't want it to be published on the internet, right? There's a huge difference between this idea of like either things are public or private or not. Like that's just not the way that we think about this stuff, because things are appropriate for certain.
Right.
And so I think that's how we have to start thinking about privacy. And then when you talk about this idea of like how hard it is actually to manage these things, it's a reason why like I don't believe companies when they say that they do privacy first, because they usually build so many options into the system that are not good defaults for the person themselves, right? And I'm actually working on like another article around communal computing, but really focused in on like the maintenance of these systems, right? And so I can imagine there's groups now that are available that like partner like OnTech is a company that partners with Google to do install of like thermostats, security cameras, and a bunch of other stuff, right? I could see this idea of the maintenance person, the handy person for the home, like helping you manage your privacy settings for these things longer term. Right now, it's very hard to do, right? Like it's something that I have to go and dig around into probably 5 different apps worth of settings to be able to like set up what my privacy stance is for my household. But I think this is something that's going to have to be worked on more because most people can't understand these types of settings. And so maybe there needs to be more legibility in how privacy actually works, right? Because like the whole thing about the concern around Amazon Ring making partnerships with local police stations is because people don't know necessarily that they're automatically being opted into these programs for basically remote policing. And that also assumes that everybody sees their local police force as their way of finding some type of justice within their local organization. When the reality is, like, you go to other countries, there are local elders, or there's other types of systems that end up figuring out disputes and dealing with evidence. And so I think there's always going to be this challenge of kind of how do you balance between this idea of privacy and opt-in and consent versus the idea of security. And I'm actually working on something right now where I'm trying to like square those two things against each other in a way that makes sense. And so you have to get back down though to the reason why people have security cameras, right? And it ends up being not necessarily, it ends up being to detect that something is happening, not necessarily a person. Like the only people you actually care about detecting are the people who know, because you want to know maybe if your child got home, right? But those people in some way maybe have opted in. But like for everybody else, like I don't even know that like this particular UPS driver dropped off a package. I just need to know that there's now a package sitting on my doorstep, right? That's very different when it comes to privacy. Versus this idea of now when we talk about security, it's that usually these things are used for what's referred to as forensic or after the fact evidence collection, right? And that's the only time that you should be able to like understand or maybe remove some privacy of someone that didn't opt in is when they broke the law. And so I think there's some interesting things that we need to start talking and thinking about there.
Yeah, and it's pretty interesting because there's always, I think, like the analog hole, like whatever you do on a device, someone can just make a plain camera from who knows when. We did have one more question from the group. They wanted to know more about how multiple users on TV affect Nielsen ratings. If you have any more details on that. I've worked with Nielsen a few different times. I'm definitely not an expert on Nielsen, but I think this is partially the reason why they also look at demographics. So like there's a lot of work that's done, like Prism was a system that was used for your kind of like zip code block. It would also start to give you kind of like what was the likelihood of you living with a family, like children, all these different things, because they knew that it wasn't just you necessarily in your household, right? Like 76% of households in the US have children in them. And so like that's a huge percentage of your population that you're probably misreading behavioral data, right? So I don't know how they would do this. I think part of their surveys would ask if there are other people in the household, but this gets to a really interesting problem. Like there's not a lot of current research that I've been able to find, and I found like a bunch between about 2001 or 3 to about 2011 of like group recommendation services and the way that should work, but I haven't seen as much recently, and so I'm wondering why that is, right? Like, and it's probably partially because it's a really hard problem. Like just for the idea of like, say, public computers or computers that are shared by multiple people, trying to discern different people's search behaviors. I saw one paper that was actually trying to pull apart like how to tell the difference between different search behaviors between different people using a Communal device, but it's really, really hard, right? And so I think that's part of the reason why is that I think that they can understand when their data is going to be less reliable about a single person by doing this is a household with children. But I think otherwise, I don't know. I'd love to hear more from the Nielsen group about like how they actually deal with that, right? And someone asked, was it 76% you said households had children?
Yeah, I can try to dig up the exact study, and I think I referenced it in my second article around kind of, I put a sidebar about children and regulation around people that are under the age of consent, but I believe it's about 76%.